Hey, you want to see a real ghost? Pretty spooky, huh? While we're on the note of spooky things, let's talk Observer. Observer is a horror game where you play as Daniel Lazarski, who is a police investigator in a cyberpunk dystopia. When the game starts out, you are in what seems to be a police car being briefed on the new addition to your body. This addition allows the player to plug themselves into the minds of the general populace through the implants they use. This premise alone is what pulled me into the game because it's an idea that I felt had a lot of potential. While I find most horror games to be not my cup of tea, I gave it a shot anyway for the narrative alone. When I say horror games are not my cup of tea, I'm mainly referring to your Amnesias or Slenderman that the genre is full of. I'm a fan of things like Dead Space or Resident Evil, where you have more options than just hiding or running away. Including other mechanics like shooting adds more to the gameplay and makes my experience a lot more entertaining. Unfortunately, Observer is far more like the former and not at all like the latter. The protagonist of this horror game is basically helpless to whatever may come his way, as he reveals early on that he is no longer allowed to carry a gun. Furthermore, the minds you explore belong to people who can't do anything but stare slack-jawed at any sort of horrifying monster. I thought I could get past something like this just to appreciate the story, but in all reality, I can't. Thankfully, that's just a small part of a much larger game. While you're being briefed at the beginning of the story, the transmission gets interrupted by the main character's son, who is thought to be dead. He says something ominous and then he cuts his connection. In typical father fashion, Dan decides to trace the call back to an apartment complex where he begins to search for his lost family. Jason! Jason! Oh wait, that's a mall. My bad. Upon arriving at the apartment complex, a slew of things happen that end with the whole place going on lockdown. This leaves the player and all of the tenants cut off from the rest of the world with no way out. To no one's surprise, this complex in a low-class city area is shadier than a forest during the summer, and soon the player stumbles upon several crime scenes that they must investigate. The mechanics to investigate things are really straightforward, but it doesn't feel tedious or boring. Clues are found with two different types of vision, one that examines things like blood and any other things relating to biology, while the other examines electronics. It can get a bit frustrating when you can't seem to find that final clue that's making you frantically search through a room for the 10th time while clicking madly, but it does feel rewarding when you finally solve a case. There is a catch though, and that catch is that each case you solve is part of a much bigger problem. This means that you tend to be left with more questions than answers. Those answers are the metaphorical carrot on the stick in this game that gets you to explore up and down the apartment complex, and it honestly works pretty well. Questions do get answered, even if some take the entire game to figure out, and that left me feeling very satisfied upon completion. My next point could definitely be attributed to the fact that I don't like to allow myself to get scared, but nothing about Observer felt particularly frightening. At most, the game just felt creepy, and a lot of the time I just ended up nitpicking all of the horror game stereotypes like, oh, it sounds like a child because child sounds are supposed to be off-putting, or here's a section where I have to hide from that guy or else I'll game over until my head spins. Which, by the way, that second example isn't scary, it's just really annoying. The only time I actually reacted was to a specific jump scare, which in my opinion is a cheap tactic that is sprinkled throughout the gameplay. Most are predictable, but one did manage to get me. Since the effectiveness of jump scares is tied to how well the atmosphere is set, I want to talk about sound design, as it is one of the biggest contributors to the atmosphere of a horror game. Overall, the sound design is well done, but there are areas that could definitely use some improvement. What I'm mainly referring to is the voice acting. It left a lot to be desired, especially when it came to the main character. The delivery of his lines is just so weak, and it felt like his tone of voice rarely changed. When it did, it still sounded really soft to the point where any attempted emotion was lost on me. Ambience is really what sets the mood well, and in Observer, its quality really makes up for any bad voice acting. It alone was able to create the creepy feeling that I was never able to shake while playing, and it's why a jump scare was effective at all. When it comes to sound, I believe people that are really interested in this genre won't be let down. So, what do I specifically like about this game? First off, the crime scene investigation I mentioned before was something I enjoyed. I was always interested to see how a certain object or clue was related to a grotesque murder. My favorite part of those investigations was when I was given the option to jump into a victim's mind. Even if it was just full of back-to-back horror sections, there were some puzzles in there that felt really fresh. I was really happy to see that the main game mechanic that pulled me in was executed very well. That's not the only cool idea that Observer has to show off, as it showcases several other gameplay mechanics I hadn't experienced before. One such mechanic included changing a radio's audio frequency to unravel a visual scenario. My description definitely doesn't do it justice, as it may sound insignificant, but when experienced in game, it's really impressive. What's really important to me is that the narrative I jumped into this game for really delivered. Had it not, I wouldn't have been interested in finding out the answers to the questions presented. Quite a bit of the world building is done through reading articles left on computer screens, and I found the content to be interesting enough to take the time to read. That's a huge plus for me, as I was far more interested in the world itself than I was all the scary parts. When it comes to giving my final verdict, I feel quite conflicted. For others like myself who are quite averse to horror games, I would not recommend this game in the slightest. While I did enjoy much about this game, at its core it is still a horror game that is full of mechanics I can't bring myself to appreciate. However, to those looking for an interesting story and don't mind what horror games entail or just really want to get scared, I'd say Observer is definitely for you. For more reviews on video games and hardware alike, as well as first looks, editorials, and build guides, be sure to head over to KBMOD.com.